think we're coming back now. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, almost good morning to everybody, because like it's, I guess, 11 a.m. where you are, and it's like 6 p.m. where Jerry is, and it's 6 a.m. where I am. So like I've been up all night, just writing this thing that I'm about to present with you. So, and thanks very much for the invitation. I was very honored to be invited to participate. And the reason why I actually got invited on the list was that Matt Rosen has edited a very good book about the relationship between speculative philosophy and horror literature called Diseases of the Head, taken from a byline from Immanuel Kant. And that was published by Punctum Books in 2020. And I wrote a chapter in that about Schopenhauer, well, a bit about Schopenhauer, but more about Lovecraft and Cthulhu and the relationship to Hartman's theory of the object-oriented ontology, or triple O. And so what I would like to do is sort of discuss something I'm working on now, jumping out from what I'd written for Matt's book, my chapter in Matt's book, as well as picking up on a couple more points about the book that I wrote about Lovecraft, The Republic of Cthulhu, which was also published by Punctum Books in 2016. Now, in my book chapter, which I'm going to be extrapolating from, there's a very important writer working with phenomenology called Dylan Trigg, who I think has produced some really interesting stuff. And he critiqued Quentin Melissu's theory about basically after finitude. And he offered, and this is from my text, he offers an interesting critique of Melissu on this point by offering up a neo-phenomenological reading of Schelling's notion of wild being, the coexistence of being with a barbaric variant of flesh. And in this sense, the universe has never been without an observer of some kind. And the same point, that the universe has never been without an observer, can also be made in relationship to panpsychism, which is a theory of mind, a part of a philosophy of mind, which has had a long and tattered history, but is actually becoming more and more popular among the neuroscientific community as a possible explanation for the existence of consciousness, which is still a hard problem, as David Chalmers called it, that we still don't seem to be able to actually crack. And that the mind and the universe co-evolve in tandem. And there are several different schools of the theory of panpsychism. And the most basic one is the one that was articulated by Bertrand Russell about 1910, and in his book on the philosophy of mind. which is basically that consciousness is to be understood in its most basic form as experiential, and that this experiential quality or qualia of consciousness is probably a systemic attribute of being itself. So that if you have any kind of universe or world that meets the philosophical definition of being real, you're going to have experiential consciousness embedded within it as a qualitative aspect of that thing. The reason why that's significant for me is that if we look at Melissu's theory of critique of anti-correlationism, he operates on the postulate that the world cannot really exist in any way that's knowable or retrievable or intelligible or coherent prior to the existence of an observer. And you have to begin with a point of observation and go forward rather than going to the back. And if you go past what exists before the observer, then that gets us into the realm of what we call unreason. Now, my theory is that that's true, but Melissu does not take panpsychism into account. And there, of course, there are two philosophers that do. Friedrich Schelling's his theory of wild being or the wild flesh that was hammered out in his various works, classic works of subjective and objective idealism in the early 19th century, and of course Schopenhauer's philosophy of the will. In that, if we read Schelling and Schopenhauer as advocating a form of panpsychism, then we can circumvent the problem of Melissu's anti-correlationism by insisting that the world has never been without an observer, in the sense that the world has never been devoid of experiential consciousness, or consciousness as experience, or as the experiential. And then from that, it's easy to make a fairly short jump to Lovecraft himself as giving artistic expression to this intuitive perception, because we can simply make the denizens of the Cthulhu mythos, interpret them as embodiments or manifestation of the principle of either wild flesh or the omnipresence of the Schopenhauerian will. That's to say, that which is pre-rational, that is embedded with unreason, but nevertheless are eternal and immanent throughout the universe as the most primitive form of experiential consciousness. So in the thing that I'm working on now, I have basically a layout, a very brief outline, which would consist of 5 basic parts: Melissu's critique of correlationism, the fundamental principles of panpsychism, Schopenhauer and panpsychism, the will and the subject-object relationship, Lovecraft and Schopenhauer, the Cthulhu mythos, and Lovecraft monsters as aesthetically spawned critics of Melissu's anti-correlationism. So I think that that's what I'm working on now. But for that to make sense, I'm going to give you kind of a very brief summation the next 15 minutes or so of actually where I am at now and where I'm actually jumping off from. So if we define I think the speculative position, which is kind of the unifying thread of speculative philosophy or speculative realism, we could define it in this way, which is the way that Fintan Nayland put it, that the universe is undergirded by a somewhat horrifying power, one which humans can know, which of course meets Schopenhauer's primary innovation over Kantian metaphysics, that the thing in itself is both real and in some sense intelligible, or at least perceptible. Secondly, the notion of unreason, which is from Quentin Melissu's After Finitude Self. Unreason is the ultimate absence of reason, an absolute ontological property, and not the mark of the finitude of our knowledge. So he invokes unreason not as simply in a kind of Wittgensteinian or skeptical sense of things that we simply cannot know because of the way that logic or our minds are constructed, but ultimately that which actually is the objective horizon. It cannot be known because unreason precedes the presence of an observer. And then we have what I call everything else, which again is from Melissu. If we look through the aperture which we have opened up into the absolute, what we see is a rather menacing power, something insensible and capable of destroying both things and worlds, of bringing forth monstrous absurdities, yet also of never actually doing anything, of realizing every dream, but also every nightmare. And then what I would like to argue, I have argued some, but I'd like to argue more in a more comprehensive work in the future, that definition is a pretty good encapsulation of both Schelling's wild flesh or wild being, and Schopenhauer's doctrine of the will. So, I also would like to include a quote from one of my favorite films, Hitler, a film from Germany by the German director Hans-Jürgen Seiberberg, because I think it expresses the aesthetic dimension of what we're actually talking about when we engage in trying to unify Lovecraft, Schopenhauer, and panpsychism. The modern age begins with the idea of the infinity of the universe, and if we think that idea through to its end, we come to unreality. For infinity is nothing but a mathematically formulated expression for unreality. If one tries to imagine concretely that the Milky Way consists of more than 1 billion fixed stars, many of which have a diameter greater than the distance between the Earth and the Sun, and that the Milky Way does not form a source of tranquility in the cosmos, but is racing somewhere at the speed of 360 miles a second, i.e. about 1,000 times as fast as a cannonball, then the assumption that this could have anything to do with reality is reduced to a mere mental game. So if we look at the strangeness of the universe that reflects itself back at us when we observe it, Melissu is able to conclude that, quote, one could say that up until Kant, one of the principal problems of philosophy was to think substance. Well, ever since Kant, it has consisted in trying to think the correlation. So again, Melissu bases everything, at least in his first book, I think apparently he's moved past this somewhat, but in his very first book, After Finitude, on the critique of correlation. Now, for Melissu, correlation does not equal correspondence, but rather verification or authentication. The thing that is established by reason depends upon that reason in order to be perceived, and therefore to be brought into existence in the first place. Quite literally, being cannot be itself, it cannot be to be or to sign, as Heidegger would say, in the absence of a self-aware observer. But the really big problem here is that what Melissu himself defines as the unresolved struggle between the physicalist Copernican revolution and the philosophical or humanist Thelemic reaction, or what we regard as the anthropocentric restoration. Post-Copernican astronomy and physics constitutes the unconditional and irreversible decentering of post-humanids as the primary actor agents of creation. The world can no longer be exclusively discussed within human terms of reference. Conversely, anti-correlationism, which is Melissu's preferred position, postulates that the thing in itself, or noumena, can be rendered knowable only to the degree that it can be translated or expressed within purely mathematical terms. So for Melissu, not surprisingly because he was a student of Badiou, for him mathematics is always the default position, the place that you go to in order to reach out for certainty. All those aspects of the object that can be formulated in mathematical terms can be meaningfully achieved as properties of the object itself. So conversely, with a Thelemic reaction, which paradoxically historically co-evolved with the Copernican revolution beginning in the 16th century, perpetuates the perhaps sophistic reassertion of humankind via the epistemological double game, or the game of bad faith, of correlationism. Any world is meaningful only to the degree that it serves as a given to a living or thinking being. So correlation consists in disqualifying the claim that it is possible to consider the realms of subjectivity and objectivity independently of one another. Not only does it become to insist that we can never grasp an object in itself in isolation from its relationship to the subject, but it always becomes necessary to maintain that we can never grasp a subject that would not always already be related to an object. So the observer, to establish truth, always has to be related to the object in the first instance. As a result, all those aspects of the object that can give rise to a mathematical thought, to a formula, or to some sort of digitalization, rather than to a perception or sensation, can be meaningfully turned into properties of the thing, not only as it is with me, but also as it is without me. So the reduction of either the Husserlian eidos or the Heideggerian real results in a radical confinement of the scope of human reality, equating the unknowable with a radically contingent. So, this is Melissu again. The thesis that we are defending is twofold. On the one hand, we acknowledge that the sensible world only exists as a subject's human relation to the world, but on the other hand, we maintain that the mathematizable properties of the object are exempt from the constraint of such a relation, and that they are effectively in or within the object in the way in which I conceive them, whether I am in relation with the object or not. Because only mathematics allows for the true expression of that which exceeds the perceptive field or the phenomenological field of the anthropocentric realm, it follows that chaos is the only true thing in itself. Being constitutes an irreducible unreason, or a kind of a hyper-chaos, by default of the absence of physical necessity, or any other thing that would permit correlationism to operate, which would be anything, any object, event, or thing that would be capable of exhaustive definition minus mathematization. What is mathematizable cannot be reduced to a correlation of thought. Ergo, whatever is mathematically conceivable is absolutely possible. And from this, it follows quite incredibly that our absolute, in effect, is nothing other than an extreme form of chaos, a hyper-chaos for which nothing is or would seem to be impossible, not even the unthinkable. Hence, reason is nothing other than the absence of necessity within the physical world of objects. Unreason should not be misunderstood as the principle or thing that guarantees the ontology of reality, conventionally associated with both reason and necessity, but is rather itself the absolute condition of absolute contingent givenness, the detotalization of the universe as the remainder of an irreducible contingency. As the remainder of an irreducible contingency. Expressed positively, unreason is nothing other than a purely mathematizable post-humanity, a world that is separate from man and is founded upon an unconditional and irreducible contingency within which anything that is mathematically conceivable is physically possible, which effectively demolishes the necessity of reason and all modes of a priori logic or reasoning. So Melissu concludes, so the challenge is therefore the following: to understand how science can think a world wherein spatio-temporal givenness itself came into being within a time and space which preceded every unity of givenness, that is temporally prior to the emergence of a self-aware observer. But contrary to first impressions, the true bête noire of Melissu's anti-correlationism is not Ptolemy, but Copernicus, but Charles Darwin, along with the groundbreaking geologist Charles Lyell. Apart from placing pure randomness at the living heart of the evolution of life, Darwin's most subversive idea was to reset the biological clock from historical time to geological time. Genesis was no longer correlative with the emergence of humans, in radical contrast to Bishop Ussher's anthropocentric dating of Genesis to the morning of 22 October 4004 BCE, but occurred in a series of aeon-lengthy stages, 13.5 billion years for the universe, 4.56 billion years for the accretion of the Earth, 3.5 billion years for the emergence of terrestrial life on the microbial level, and a cosmically laughable 2 million years for the emergence of the very first form of human, or Homo habilis. So empirical science is today capable of producing statements about events anterior to the advent of life, as well as its consciousness. How are we to grasp the meaning of scientific statements being explicit upon a manifestation of the world that is positive as interior to the emergence of thought and even of life? Positive, that is, as the interior to every form of human relation to the world. Or to put it more precisely, how are we to think the meaning of a discourse which construes the relation to the world, that of thinking and or living, as a fact inscribed in a temporality within which this relation is just one event among others, inscribed in an order of succession in which it is merely a stage rather than an origin? How is science able to think such statements, and in what sense can we eventually ascribe truth to them? So essence or temporality, it precedes existence or biological life. The dehumanizing, detotalizing quanta of inhuman time undermines correlationism, leaving us with the sole comfort of awareness of the potential, but ultimately exhaustible mathematization of phenomenon. This in turn yields us two of Melissu's signature concepts, ancestrally and the arc fossil. Ancestrality, or the ancestral, is a reality anterior to the emergence of the human species, while the arc fossil denotes all materials indicating the existence of an ancestral reality or event, one that is interior to terrestrial life. The cosmic payoff, if I can put it like that, is nothing other than an eternal and absolute non-negotiable contingency. If the ancestral is thinkable, then an absolute must be thinkable. The resolution of what is nothing short of a metaphysical crisis following the publication of Lyell's and Darwin's Origin of Species by Natural Selection demands nothing less than unconditional capitulation to post-human mathematical discourse. So long as we believe there must be a reason why what is the way that it is, we will continue to feel superstition, which is to say the belief that there is an inevitable reason underlying all things. Since we will never be able to discover or understand such a reason, all we can do is believe in or aspire to believe in it. So long as we construe our access to facticity, unreason, in terms of thought's discovery of its own intrinsic limits and its inability to uncover the ultimate reason for things, our abolition of metaphysics will only have served to resuscitate religiosity in all of its forms, including the most menacing ones. So long as we construe facticity as a limit for thought, we will abandon whatever lies beyond this limit to the rule of piety. That would be true up to the point that we can then make what I could argue would be the jump to a panpsychical approach to understanding the universe, which is that if we can, in fact, plausibly and intelligibly postulate both the universality and the eternity of experiential consciousness, or consciousness as the experiential, as a systemic property of the building blocks of the universe itself, then we have, in fact, arguably sidestepped the problem of anti-correlationism, as Melissa has laid it out, and that if we were looking for a philosophical alternative to the anti-correlationist approach, both Schelling and Schopenhauer, with their respective metaphysical systems, would provide us something that we could actually work with. And then again, to repeat in my conclusion, as I began with my introduction, the Lovecraftian aesthetic would be one way of conceptualizing how we could give artistic or an intuitive, emotive almost, way of expressing and formulating the first move past anti-correlationism. So anyway, that's my presentation. It's a work in progress. That's about all I have for now. Thanks. I got one fan.
Sometimes that's all you need, man. Sometimes you
just. That's right. Well, if you're working from a basement from Osaka, that counts for a lot.
On the opposite side of the earth, but
that's right, and we're unified.
Straight through
you know what we call this? You know what we call this? Quantum entanglement.
Right through the tunnel in the middle of the earth, right?
That's right. So you must be in the hole, and I must be in Sorcerer City. So,
exactly. So we just have to animate it, and then we'll understand. Yeah. Oh, very nice.
Thanks.
So we're going to talk about afterwards, right? So I've made notes, but I'm sure.
I know. It was, it was easy. You can't go down the path until you like shovel all this stuff out. So I just had to shovel it out, and then set up a discussion. I hope so. Okay. Yeah, you're the one who said that, not me. Okay. Okay.
Even slow it down.
Yeah. Well, I was worried about time, man. I know Jerry wanted to have his whole 50 minutes. So
yeah, but I think that you kind of I think you had until like 6. I don't know what time it is, but time like 6:30. But yeah, I think you finished record speed. Kind of 4:20, but no problem. Okay. Yeah, so I'm going to be kind of linking the kind of opening quote that was used on PhilosophyCon's website from the Call of Cthulhu, and kind of linking that, using that as a kind of, I don't know, a wedge or a model by which to then talk about the novel that I wrote, which is called Terminalian Drift. And so I'm going to be, I prepared the text, so I'm going to read this. And so, the title of my talk is called Embodying Selves in the Skin of an Other, Horror and Knowing and the Novel Terminalian Drift. At the start of the Call of Cthulhu, we read from documents left behind by the late Francis Thurston, where he offers something that serves as an observation of and an instruction for living with the mind. He states, "The most merciful thing in this world is, it seems to me, the inability of the human mind to correlate all of its contents. We live on a peaceful island of ignorance in the middle of the black seas of infinity, and we are not destined to travel far." In this passage, which is used to greet visitors to this conference's website, Lovecraft's narrator in The Call of Cthulhu, Francis Thurston, sketches a geographic map of the human mind. The story's voice introduces the reader to a geopsychographic metaphor in which a tame island of ignorance is contrasted to the mind's oceanic and evil abyss. But how should we understand this island of blessed ignorance? The narrating voice explains that this merciful and peaceful island results from a lack, an inability, which saves us from the mind's chaotic seas of knowing. This peaceful ignorance saves us by limiting what we know of the vastness that the mind knows. This merciful island in the mind is the human capacity to forget what we know. Thus, what we know is only part of all we know. This is the merciful ignorance of forgetting that, and means that the threat to this peace is knowing too much. The merciful peace is threatened by remembering too much. Thus, we can conclude that knowing too much of what we know is a form of cruelty. Forgetting erects a protective shoreline against the roiling seas of memory, that horror of knowing what we know. This implies that we are constantly under threat of being terrorized by our own mind, by memory of our life, by the monstrous and excessive self that knows more than peace can stand. The horror of life portrayed in this image is lurking in our abyss, threatening the peaceful self with knowing. There is definitely an irony that this quote is used to greet us into this conference. We risk destroying the peace of our ignorance by meeting here and making memories, making more knowing. But I trust all of us here are not afraid to exceed where destiny says we shouldn't. Maybe it's even fun. Maybe we care less about the peaceful bliss of ignorance than Mr. Thurston. Perhaps we enjoy experiencing brushes with horror because of what such dangers teach us and how they transform the fragile shoreline of the island of the self-deluded self. It's more thrilling, anyway, and it is largely why I enjoy thinking and writing. I like how my island of comfortable self gets threatened, undermined, and transformed by the abyss of letting characters lead me into their odd worlds. Similar to Lovecraft's The Call of Cthulhu, my 2021 novel Terminalian Drift is guided by a narrating voice that takes the reader through a psychogeographic landscape. But this world of roaming is much more intimate than an isolated island set against vast seas. Rather than traveling to exotic corners of the world searching for details to confirm or refute a monstrous power that lurks somewhere in the darkness of the world, the voice in Terminalian Drift takes us into familiar city streets. The voice in Terminalian Drift leads us on a tour of Osaka, Japan, to resolve a conflict that roils within its skin, or more accurately, to resolve a conflict that exists between itself and a new skin, or rather, a new used skin. For early on in the novel, we learn that the narrating voice in Terminalian Drift is moving around Osaka City within a recently acquired used skin, which the voice purchased off Amazon about a month before. More specifically, the skin is that of 20th century conceptual artist André Caturay. You see, that's what this narrating voice does. The voice switches from skin to skin and has been doing so for decades. But life in Caturay's skin is not going so well for the narrating voice. This has not been a happy re-embodiment for the voice. And the get to know you stage has been kind of excessively uncomfortable. So the story's voice takes us out for a walk in the streets of Osaka as it tries to rebalance the opposing territorializing energies of its familiar inner depths and the new used outer surface, tries to establish a new normal. Because if a mutual balance can be achieved, the voice expects things will improve and the new skin will become something like a, quote, fleshy spaceship with time travel options, end quote. As this adventurous description implies, taking a new skin is a means for going beyond the voice's familiar here and now. The voice's skin switching practice offers new modes of knowing. Like all of us here at PhilosophyCon who were not deterred by the quote that cautioned us on the conference's website, this skin switching voice is not afraid of too much knowing or how unwelcome memories might flood it with turmoil and transform the settled shape of itself. The voice goes out looking for ways to blur the clear and to destabilize the settled. If we compare the voice's skin-switching desires to the island in ocean's map that Lovecraft's narrator draws, the re-embodying voice in Terminalian Drift hopes to exceed the ignorance that staying in a familiar skin limits it to, and thereby the voice expects to travel farther than what destiny imposes. The skin-switching practice hinted at in the novel is a method for dissolving destiny's hegemony, revealing it as merely an option rather than an obligation. But the voice in the story isn't completely okay with the present reality of being in André Caturay's skin. Not yet, anyway. So far, the life in Caturay's skin has felt overly crowded, too co-residential, too haunted. Caturay's skin is not fitting well and causing excessive discomfort, perhaps similar to the danger posed to the self's little island by too much knowing. The voice in Terminalian Drift knows from previous experiences that the early stages of embodying an other's skin always require a suspension of some control. But the discomfort level this time seems too much. So the voice hopes wandering the winter streets of Japan's second largest city will facilitate a mutual letting go by both the self and the skin, which brings with it more than just an exterior appearance. The voice says, quote, "The differences between a skin I change into and one I change out of always feel irritating and bothersome in the beginning. Little things irritate and make me doubt the choice to change, at least until a bit of my sweat and scent start to soak in and territorialize the new. It's normal that I need to bring the former owner's claims on the skin to a more clear, or at least more believable, termination. Evict the ghost, as it were, make the other mine." And that was my goal for being in the city on that February day. That's why I was walking the streets and drifting around. I was hoping to alter my relationship with the new skin. I was hoping to suspend previously established arrangements. It's not unreasonable for me to want to feel at home in a skin, or at least not feel like I'm constantly under the threat of eviction. I have a right to push back and press out. I have a right to shape what contains me. Maybe it's even a duty. And from my experience over the years, part of the process of getting placed well inside a new skin involves heat and getting the skin to a point of fitting flexibility, of feeling fitting flexibly. When a skin fits, I can feel less self-conscious about the mundane stuff. I don't need to think about turning a doorknob or how my feet are placed beneath a chair. I don't need to think each detail when using a fork or lifting a glass of water to my lips. When the noticeable goes unnoticed, that's when I feel I've come to belong in a skin. This sense of belonging definitely happens when the skin physically changes, adjusts, becomes more subtle, flowing, and pliable on my muscles, bones, joints, etc. It comes when the skin starts working with my habits of gesture, when it fits my movements. But it's also about me changing. A new skin makes me lose something inside, makes me work with unknowns, makes me become a bit other. And that is a big part of why I do all this. It makes me become something else, end quote. A self is not just a ghost with a housing issue. Skins themselves can arrive in the mail as haunted sites of residence, with their own ghostly traces from former occupants lingering within muscle memory, scar history, traumas, and lusts. And as the narrating voice describes it, quote, in a used skin, there are often bouts of memory seep. At times, they are regular occurrences, and other times they are random floods of flashbacks that transfer the skin's experiences to the cognitive meat of me. They are how the skin weaves a net of references, sensory hallucinations and mystery itch. Traces of incidents continue echoing in the flesh, like a needle prick, or a punch in the gut, or a lazy caress. Across the gap between meat and skin, the past leaps with its hooks and strings, building a lattice of habits, urges, addictions, and drives. A skin offers its gifts and threats. A skin tries to train my brain to its thousand churning hungers and wills. It tries to shape me to fit the world filtered by its surfaces. Those are its territorializing efforts, trying to shape how I should experience its form as I move inside it, inside the world. The skin wants me to believe how it shapes the world's surfaces with its touch and step and sniff and lick. It wants me to believe in the way it includes me in its presumed totality. The skin wants me to believe it about how everything is of it. But I can't just let the skin control these things. I have to push back. I have to push out at the skin's limits, end quote. In my novel, we get a glimpse into a secret layer of society in which people remove and put on skins. They buy, sell, and trade skins with other practitioners of what we learn is an ancient activity which has adopted modern methods and means. By living in different skins, the voice reveals how it hopes to exceed the limits that staying in a single skin might require. Variety offers experiential comparisons in the first person. Living in different skins offers a plurality of intimacies that convey knowledge to the practitioner. In putting on a used skin, its past becomes the voice's present. Because being can't easily get free of what's been. Ontology is largely hauntology. The memories stored in skins partly shape the self within. And that seems to be what attracts the narrating voice to this lifestyle. The voicing self wants to be altered by familiarizing itself with unfamiliar energies, by doing the same thing, but in a different body, by fitting in, losing itself, and becoming a bit other. This idea of transforming the familiar is largely inspired by psychogeographic walking practices, ideas which inform the creation of this story. This novel developed as an experiment in using psychogeographic methods for spurring a place-specific story into life. Moving within the specific district within Osaka City, I let the actual locations and happenings that occurred inform and guide the events that appear in the story. In psychogeographic terms, I used methods of drift to facilitate the pseudo-documentary development of the story. The drift in the novel's title derives from that practice of moving through a geographic area with altered or augmented intentions, the goal being to make the familiar unfamiliar, and thereby to re-enliven an area of a city that has grown dull and mundane due to excessively rote interactions with it. Routine patterns of daily life can obscure the wonderment in our surroundings, and psychogeography provides methods for releasing us from lazy ways of seeing. For the novel, I adapted these psychogeographic walking methods for use in the surreal lifestyle practice of switching skins. A similar dullness has a way to stultify the self. It lulls the self into patterns of rote familiarity, a presumed state of peaceful ignorance in which forgetting takes over. Self becomes afraid of change, forgetting the fact that life is defying death at every breath. The voice in Terminalian Drift embodies the enlivened threat of change and self-transformation. The voice invites more memories than even rightfully belong to it to flood in and do their damage, to suspend stability of self. This behavior enacts a quiet horror of excessive knowing that Lovecraft's narrator asserts forgetting mercifully protects against. In Terminalian Drift, we see evidence that the narrating self is in constant drift. The self consists of multiple fragments rather than a stable and predictable form. The self is an ever accumulating and ever culminating assemblage of its previous selves that have occupied various skins through time. Each new exterior skin provides a new vehicle and system of filters for the self to newly experience the world. This portrayal of such a layering of shape-shifting selves verges on making it almost a monster novel. The main character embodies the potential for unpredictable transformation. Too many voices crowd into a single mouth, making it hard to limit who are talking to who. The multiplicity of self-layers obscure and blur and create unsureness, like the inky dark seas that threaten to flood the island's frail but predictable beaches. The fathomless depths of self can be terrifying. They can echo wildly of others and others and others. And this is what makes this first-person day-in-the-life documentary of a skin-switching practitioner in Osaka verge on horror genre. While protecting merciful peace is found from negating, while protected merciful peace is found from negating more than one needs to be, let me say that again. While protecting merciful peace is found by negating more than what needs to be known, when the firm edge of self is allowed to blur with excess, monsters can come out and mingle. Terminalian Drift isn't meant to be horror. It's meant to be exploratory, to function as a means by which I could analyze the energies and limits that shape self. More than a story of a monster, I think the story is an extended meditation on empathy. In the classic method for activating empathy, we are told to walk a mile in another person's shoes. Basically, this asks me to imagine how I would feel if I lived the life of the other person. How much more empathetic would it be to live in another's skin rather than just their shoes? Empathy derives from becoming other by climbing inside an other's skin. Empathy is inherently self-altering. To imagine or feel how another feels requires a blurring of one's self-surety. Empathy assumes that what I know is not enough, that I have to not be ignorant of the difference that someone else's life, that someone else lives within. Empathy experiments with becoming other and learning from the comparison. Empathy is partly about letting ourself become the monster, because empathy requires us to find commonality with difference, possibly extreme difference. Monsters are regularly created as embodiments of extreme otherness. Monsters are dangerous based on our presumptions of their difference and our desire to protect ourselves on our fragile island of ignorance. But monsters also fascinate our desires. We want to search them out, but not as an act of empathy. Monsters are recognizable because they are ourself, embodying cruelty. They are the knowledge we know but want to forget as a means of offering mercy to ourself. We make monsters in the inverse of empathy. Instead of imagining ourselves living in the other's monstrous skin, we make the monster by turning our own skin inside out. We see our intimate interior as unrecognizable, or we see a surface of the other which we fail to see within ourselves. As Lovecraft's metaphor implies, the denial of self-excess makes the island of ignorance as well. We ignorantly believe that the world ends at the edge of our island of skin. We forget how much we really know in order to believe that nothing connects to us beyond our presumed limits. We imagine the vast contents of our mind to be dark and monstrous. And that is perhaps why horror stories are so attractive. They show us things that we presume are beyond our limits, that cruelty can be rites of pleasure, that the disgusting can be delicious, that the grotesque can glisten as beautiful. Horror lures us off our peaceful island and into our mind's dangerously transformative contents. That's all I've got. Thank you very much, everybody. Okay. So I had lots of notes that I wanted to try to understand about Eric's talk, but there was one thing that I wanted to ask. So Eric, you brought up the idea of kind of absolute chaos. Absolute chaos is the only real thing in itself, right?
Right.
And what I mean, I'm not sure I understand that completely, but what I feel I understand it is that chaos or absolute chaos means that nothing is nothing. Nothing is anything. That everything that we may kind of assert is form or is something is actually in a state of chaos. Or can you explain that?
Sure. There are two ways. Well, I mean, I think there are two basic ways of defining chaos. There's chaos in the more positive sense of disorder, change, transmutation, contingency, radical circumstance, that sort of thing. And there's this sort of the more negative way, which I think is what Miss Melissa and what I was kind of working on in the paper here, which is chaos is sort of the residue of everything that we don't know. Therefore, we cannot exclude from within it anything in advance.
Can you say that again?
Sure. Chaos may be better, at least in the negative sense of chaos, can be maybe well understood as being the residue of that which we cannot preclude in advance, because we cannot know the interior of the thing that we're talking about. It's a little bit like the black box problem, right? If you've got a black box and there's something in it, how can you exclude what's not in it until you perceive it directly? But if you cannot perceive it directly, that means potentially there's anything in it. And it's sort of that epistemological uncertainty of the closed set versus the open set that may be involved chaotically. Because sometimes when I was listening to talk about your novel, you were sort of putting, I think, the positive definition of chaos forward: transmutation, change, the protean, Cthulhu's tentacles spreading everywhere, right, multiplying all the time. But the other one, of course, is the uncertainty of what's there and the unknowability. We know there's something there, but we can't know what it is. Right. And in that sense, it is chaotic because it's simply unknowable. whatever its actual positive characteristics are. And that's why when I was hearing about your novel, the question I was going to simply ask you is, have you ever seen the movie The Thing?
No.
By John Carpenter.
But I've never seen it.
You definitely should watch that, because the movie was flashing through my mind as I was listening to you talk. Because you know what actually the film's about?
I only know that there is a film called The Thing, but I've never. Yeah. I don't know really anything about it except it's a horror film. That's all.
Well, it was a breakthrough horror movie in the early 1980s. I mean, some of the effects are a little bit. This is pre-CGI, but I mean, they were doing prosthetics, but they were great prosthetics for the early 80s. And it's about a bunch of Americans that are actually marooned in deep winter in a research station in Antarctica, and this dog runs in from the nearby Norwegian camp. And there are people from the Norwegian camp trying to kill it. And of course, they kill the guys who are trying to kill the dog. And the dog actually starts mutating eventually. And what it is that a spaceship crashes 100,000 years ago. The Norwegian team finds it, and they accidentally release this thing that's frozen in the ice. And the thing is simply called The Thing. And the thing about The Thing is that it can assume any form. In other words, it actually penetrates your bloodstream, and it actually starts colonizing all your cells. Until you yourself become the thing. And once you've been thing-eyed or thingified, you become infinitely mutable. You can transform yourself in anything. So it's a little bit like your skin, except that the difference is that with the skin, as I understood you, it's something that's sort of coming in from the outside, rearranging the interior, whereas with the thing, the interior is already rearranged, and it's expressing itself into the outside differently.
Yeah,
but in both cases,
it's very interesting. The one of the differences I would definitely see is the skins in the story. They're skins, and so it's almost like the person who purchases it, they have to take off a skin and then put on almost like it's a jumpsuit, right? And then it creates this new. There's not much modification that goes with it, except that the skin carries these links to previous inhabitants.
Traces.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I had another question about. So it was interesting that you divide, or you kind of clarified these two different chaoses, a positive and a negative. So the one being a kind of protean, always transforming type of thing. And so in your talk, you talked about that chaos is the only real thing in itself, right? Or that idea. Right. And then can you explain that a little bit more?
Sure. In other words, I'm using the thing in itself, or the in itself, in the Kantian sense of the noumena. Right. Yeah. The universe is constructed between two epistemological regimes, the noumenal and the phenomenal. The phenomenal is what we see, perceive. And of course, Schopenhauer fine-tuned this a great deal, because of course he took Kantianism to its absolute logical extremity. And the world, of the way that, that's why he starts out his world is will and representation, with the idea that the world is my idea of it, or actually translated from the German better, the world is my presentation of it. The world as it appears to us is exactly right in terms of its internal consistency, but it is completely unreal as to what lies behind it, which is the noumenal, right? And one of the big arguments that separates Kant and some of the earlier idealists from Schopenhauer, who basically deconstructed German idealism, is that to what degree can you perceive the noumenal? Kant says you can't at all, so we simply block it out and then focus on the phenomenal, knowing, however, that there is a noumenal there that supports the phenomenal by standing behind it, although we cannot directly perceive it. Schopenhauer believed, and I think Schelling did too, with his theory of wild being, which is not unlike his theory of the will, that it is in fact possible, going through what Melissa would call as apertures, to actually perceive that reality. The difference, of course, is that Melissa simply engages in pure mathematical reconstruction, mathematization, whereas Schopenhauer has a kind of an intuitive, I don't want to call romantic exactly, but certainly a kind of a sense of an intuitive cognitive sense of actually deducing through inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning what exactly the will actually consists of. And he concludes that it's actually radically experiential. right? It's actual raw data, raw experience itself, manifesting itself through various forms of presentation, which is the way that the world appears to us. Okay, so that's what we, in that sense, what we mean by chaos. But Melissu's meaning is a little bit different. There's no doubt Schopenhauer regards the will as absolutely chaotic, but Melissu is a little bit different in that, insofar as he says that being itself is chaotic in the negative sense, that we can't know what it is other than through mathematical construction, and whatever does not subject itself to mathematical construction, therefore, in a sense, is the true noumenal, that which actually cannot be known. And that's why he says we're stuck when we go backwards in time, because we can't go backwards in time empirically beyond the moment in time in which the first observer emerged, right? That's the Darwinian subversion, right? The only way we can attain any degree of perception about it is through mathematical construction. But you're still sort of projecting outwards, backwards into a thing that may be absolutely unknowable, because we cannot mathematically know beyond the moment in time in which we actually begin. In other words, can we know anything about the time the universe starts before the time that we're actually in it? And if your answer is no, then we're stuck. We are facing a kind of a wall of chaos.
So is that a problem? Is that a problem of individual being, that we can't go beyond what we previously know? You know, like what you said, like we can't go back to that point without. Or you said something like that. I had
let me back up and try a different way. That's the argument between correlationism and anti-correlationism. Correlationism is the human-friendly view of the universe. That mind, external reality, meaning mental reality, and external reality, meaning physical reality, in some sense match up. Right? We have phenomenal experience, and the phenomenality of our experience gives us the confidence and the objective means by which we can know the entirety of the world, even including that which preceded our being in the world in the first place. In the anti-correlationist approach, which is the one Melissu figures, which is he calls is the big anthropocentric fatal flaw of Western philosophy, is you can't actually do that. You cannot actually know that which is without an observer, because anything that precedes the existence of the observer is inherently unknowable, because the knowability itself at no point precedes the existence of that which is the knower. So that's why the early universe, that which is before us, in some sense will always be chaotic, meaning unretrievable. Utterly and finally unknowable. And that's why, of course, the Lovecraftian mythos thing is kind of an artistic way of getting around that problem, because it reflects a Schopenhauerian understanding of the will. No, there's always been a consciousness present in some form. The catch is, and this is back to Thurston, right? Kind of, backwards through the rear window. If you believe that we exist on a small island of knowledge within an ocean of ignorance, how do we know that is our situation? Well, Lovecraft provides us with an answer. The ancient ones exist. The ancient ones have been the observers, forcing the universe into existence and reality by observing it through their capacity to observe, because they're eternal and omnipresent. The problem is that the ancient ones are radically and pathologically, violently anti-human. So in other words, we know there's a world there, and we can know that it's absolutely inhuman, but we can only know it's absolutely real and absolutely inhuman because we know that there's been an absolutely inhuman observer from the beginning. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying that's what the theory is.
I'm just trying to wrap my head around it, Yeah. So part of my question, I don't know I'll can even say this question either, but I wonder, can perception, in one person and another, is it totally separate from, is the universe that is perceived by one, can it be shared with another? I mean, does that, it seems like you're saying that there are beings in the past, for example, what you call wild flesh, or the ancients from Lovecraft, and that somehow makes the universe what, perceivable, or
here's the thing: it makes it perceivable, but also makes it perhaps unknowable. But in other words, what we know with certainty is we can perceive that which is the exact opposite of us. It's inhuman. And you were talking about empathy, for example, in your paper. You cannot respond to it empathetically, but we can know it. We can know that it's there. See, this is every Lovecraft hero during the later works, the Lovecraft protagonists, right? Shadow out of Innsmouth, Mountains of Madness, right? They come up against something that basically annihilates them, within which they cannot live, but they know that it's real. They know that it precedes them, and that we know with certainty that there's a reality that precedes, that is anterior to us, but which is completely inhospitable to us. And that's how you actually kind of hammer out a new kind of epistemology, right? We can know this to that degree, but we cannot know anything past that point.
Yeah. I see.
Anyway, if you haven't seen The Thing, watch it. Definitely. They did a remake a couple years ago. It wasn't as good as even Carpenter's movie was a remake, John Carpenter's film. But I mean, it really was. It's about putting on different skins, or I should say, different skins putting themselves on other people.
Okay, yeah, I'll check it out. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. John Campbell? Yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah. Right. So in a sense, it's purely experiential.
And why not? Why could you never express it? That whole thing, I feel like I've written in this book, and then in other things too. I'm quite interested with the experience between, this talking voice inside of us, this kind of consciousness, for lack of a better term, and the skin that the bodies that we live in, and the fact that, to me, the awareness of being in my body and things occurring to me through the body are different from what the body experiences existence as. And so this kind of incredibly intimate relationship that I have with my body, I'm always here with it, but yet I am so little aware of what it is aware of. My body has a different, I think, not a kind of expressible kind of awareness. It doesn't speak to me in language. And I can only kind of, maybe glimpse some aspects of what my body is aware of. But I know my body is aware of things because it processes it. It's doing things. It's adjusting temperatures, or it's transforming my lunch into energy or whatever. So it has these systems that it is operating, and it does them. It's able to produce things like a little, as a metaphor, like a little factory. I put in this material, which is food, and it's able to make, chemical enzymes that make me feel good, right? To make dopamine or adrenaline or all of these things. And I have no ability to understand how to make that. Maybe if I study, I could see how it's made, how the body makes it, but I cannot make that. I cannot produce those things that only the body kind of can do without thought per se. So when you were talking about that inexpressibility of what was it, that primordial chaos, part of me feels like, that's maybe what the body is constantly experiencing. It is constantly experiencing this kind of present moment, which is not duplicatable. It's not a I don't know how to say, but it's always a present now and here. The body is always responding, even if I personally don't like it or enjoy it. The body will endure it. The body will hang itself. The body will jump off. Is capable of doing that. It to me just fascinates me that the body can, for example, just when I fall asleep and my arm is twisted underneath my body doesn't, maybe it moves or maybe it doesn't. It just fascinates me how much the body is able to do that I just can't do. That makes no sense at all.
Well, I mean, run back for a little bit. Taking up to Matthias' point, one of the reasons why it's difficult to convey mystical experiences is that if we work on the assumption of a dualistic model, phenomenal and noumenal, and the two worlds are parallel but incompatible, if you actually penetrate the noumenal by whatever means, you have no common set of references or shared symbolic assumptions in order to describe that reality. And Matthias is talking about the principium individuatis. It's actually in Arthur Schopenhauer's A World as Will and Presentation, Volume 1, Chapter 23, The Objectification of the Will. And in a sense, that what he was talking about when you were actually describing the body. And if I can just do a quick quotation from Schopenhauer here, will as thing in itself, which is the noumenal realm, lies, according to what has been stated, outside the domain of the principle of sufficient ground in all of its modes, and is consequently absolutely groundless, although all of its phenomena are thoroughly subject to the principle of sufficient ground. It is also free from all plurality, which I think is the realm of the body, although its phenomena in time and space are innumerable. It is itself one, but not as an object is one, of whose unity we are cognizant only in its contrast with possible plurality, nor either as a concept is one having arisen only by abstraction from plurality, but is rather one as that which lies beyond time and space, the principium individuatness, the possibility of plurality. Only when all of this is made fully explicit for us by the following consideration of phenomena and various manifestations of the will we fully understand the sense of the Kantian doctrine that time, space, and causality do not pertain to the thing in itself, but are only cognitive forms, right? Yeah. You don't understand how the enzymes are produced, but you feel the effects because you are living from the day to day.
Right, right. And even my experience of those enzymes that occur within, like I see a friend and I give a hug, it occurs within this kind of experience of this kind of story that I am telling myself. But even that my own, perception of the experience is perhaps a filtered type of thing. And in part, I feel like everything that we experience, we are constantly experiencing, but only aware or perceiving a very little bit of it. Right. And it requires me to direct my attention to it. But at the same time, there are many, many other things going on. I'm speaking right now, but at the same time, I'm thinking about, I have to put my bike inside, So these things that are going on, it's not, I don't know, like focusable. Like I can pick out things that are going on, and I can then kind of use as saying, "Oh, this is what I'm thinking." But in fact, I'm thinking, a chaos of different things, or a lot of different things. But all of that feels like it is, from what I could understand. Like you said that there is a lack. There is no plurality. There is only a unity.
Mm. Yeah. So, phenomenally, there is a plurality. Nominally, there is no plurality.
Yeah, so that kind of sense of that everything, the plurality is a perception, but the only way that plurality could take place, like a lot of what you talked about, I have more experience in like Buddhist philosophy and the idea of emptiness. Of that basically nothing exists, right? And everything exists because nothing exists. And this is, I think, very much this kind of noumenal and what was the other term?
Phenomenal,
right? Yeah. And because nothing exists, then all of these things can exist in their kind of relative forms. All of them are relative and perceivable because of the relative relationship between them.
Yeah, and if we want to look at a Christian parallel to that, Catholic Catholicism, there's Meister Eckhart as well, who was a huge influence on Schopenhauer, and he said very much the same thing. He said God is actually a form of emptiness.
Yeah.
And actually, that's really what he meant. It's this kind of void of pure potentiality,
right?
That manifests in a particular way, but every manifestation is itself really kind of a variation of the underlying unity.
Yeah, and like everything is constantly culminating into the form that is this again, and everything is shifting from place to place. Just physically, we can see this on a atomic or subatomic level. Everything is moving. Nothing really is disappearing. Everything is changing form, becoming other. And in that sense, every little particle, every bit is somewhere at every time, and that rearrangement is constantly what I would say is kind of a model for this noumenal. Everything is in a different location, but it's all present.
Well, that's quantum entanglement.
Yeah, exactly.
And Bernard Kastrup, who's this theoretical physicist working in the Netherlands right now, said straight out his way he spoke on Schopenhauer. The great thing about Schopenhauer is he basically anticipated and solved most of the paradoxes of what we now call quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
Which is that the fact that things are entangled in exactly the way that you said, which actually proves, and this is Schopenhauer's take on it, proves that our perception of time and space are fundamentally illusory. They're real for us because we're in the phenomena. Yeah. But they're ultimately illusory because what entanglement proves that everything is actually in the same space.
Yeah, and then there's a book I read by Karen Berard where she takes this idea of quantum entanglement and basically says, because of this, nothing exists we can't say that anything exists because nothing's stable. Nothing is stable for longer than almost no time at all. And so we, again, through our perception, we can say like, oh yeah, the table is still here, but it's this, we know it's this constantly shifting thing. It's not in any particular place. Yeah. Anyway, fascinating.
So, and it's also one of the paradoxes too. We know what we're seeing isn't really real, but we're all seeing the unreality in approximately the same way.
Right. So
you and I will both see the same table.
Yeah.
But what we're really doing in this sense is suffering from a common illusion.
Right. We're agreeing.
It appears to us in the same way.
Yeah, we're agreeing to see the same table.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to, and that's what I think is fascinating about your idea of the panpsychism, that consciousness and experience are so directly linked.
Yeah.
So that so the experience that we're having, it feels like it's true that the nominal can exist, that the absolute chaos, that nothing has, or not, that's not the absolute chaos, the idea, but the kind of coexistence of these two levels, that the nominal, the formless, can exist, of course, and at the same time the relative or perceived or experiential can also exist on that, right? And nothing maintains for very long because it can't, right? There's this I think Swiss, I can't remember, what was his name? Martin Hoagland. He wrote about what is it? Radical atheism.
He's a crime writer?
No, he's a philosopher. Yeah. He wrote a book. The thing that I read was called Radical Atheism, and the idea is that nothing, if nothing was sacrificed, if things were not constantly basically being destroyed and sacrificed for everything else, then nothing could exist. If anything could maintain a stability, then nothing could continue. There would be no life.
Which would be no problem for us if we understood reality as experiential.
Yeah, and then, but
in other words, what he's describing is exactly the way it should be if, like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, the early Nietzsche, we give priority to the experiential.
What do you mean by that? Can you explain that?
What I mean is that you just said nothing should exist for very long, which in other words, if the noumenal is the experiential, then the phenomenal world would be a world in which nothing would last for very long.
Nothing would last for very long.
Because what's important is the experiential, the process of new experience, new becoming, new events.
Right.
Whether or not it's rational or absurd, we can talk about some other time. But we would, in other words, we would expect to see radical finitude in a phenomenal world. If it is the case that the noumenal world is pure experientiality.
Interesting.
Okay, if I can interrupt your fascinating discussion.
Yeah.
There's a question from the audience. For Eric, it's a bit long.
Yeah, too bad.
I have a bit of a late question to the first speaker concerning this panpsychism you spoke about at the beginning of your speech. Its modern understanding arose in the 16th century, but has much larger roots, maybe even in Aristotle's passive intellect and its Averroistic interpretation in the Middle Ages. Moreover, it often had some connections with pantheism even in our times, Desjardins, for example. My question is, do you think that panpsychism has this connection to pantheism according to the authors you have spoken about? And a follow-up question, if so, is it possible to reconcile pantheism with belief in good and evil?
So now, could you please repeat, there were two questions. Could you please repeat the first one? I couldn't quite hear the first one. I think I heard the second one okay.
Okay, so the question is, do you think that panpsychism has this connection to pantheism according to the authors you have spoken about?
But pantheism. See, to answer that question, I would have to come up with a comprehensive definition of pantheism, which I'm a little reluctant to do on the spot like this. But I'll put it to you this way: in terms of the history of philosophy, and which is one that more and more neurobiologists and neuropsychiatrists and neuropsychologists are beginning to pay attention to, and also as well. Philip Galen as well, or Philip Strawson has actually come back and written a very, very good piece about panpsychism as well. He's recently become a convert because he says there's no other way to explain the experientiality of consciousness other than by assuming that it is in some sense dispersed within being itself as an attribute or systemic property of being. Historically, we've always understood the two concepts of panpsychism and pantheism to be related. I am not going to go out on a limb and say they're identical, but there are simple, clear convergences, both in terms of philosophy and in terms of intellectual history and the history of philosophy. In terms of the Nietzschean problem of beyond good and evil, that takes us into Nietzsche territory, which is always a bit of a landmine. I will simply say that I'll go back to the guy who taught Nietzsche everything he knew, mostly Arthur Schopenhauer, and simply say, I'm not sure that good and evil, beyond good and evil is really the right word. I would actually prefer a slightly more comprehensive term, which is simply nihilism or nihilistic. But not nihilism in the sense of necessarily anything that would necessarily devalue all values, merely something that would simply encompass every conceivable or possible value, because the experiential reality, the noumenal as experiential, opens the door to a radical, like you said, as we were talking about with Jerry, we're talking about a world of such extreme finitude that by default, it becomes a world of extreme plenitude, meaning constant perpetual change. And that in that sense, yeah, I get to see it. But I'm more comfortable with the language of nihilism than beyond good and evil, simply because nihilism in this sense can mean not simply the fact that there's nothing, but that there's a kind of an everything that becomes at some point simply indescribable. It supersedes our capacity to cogitate and to describe, denote, name, classify.
Mm-hmm.
That would be my answer, a tentative answer.
Okay, thank you.
But yeah, the connection between pantheism and panpsychism is clearly there. There's no doubt about it.
Mm-hmm. So what about good and evil and pantheism? Can these ideas be reconciled?
Okay, I'll put it to you this way. I was reading Kokowski's chapter on this very short chapter on Meister Eckhart in his book about the history of philosophy. He does 50 chapters on 50 philosophers. And he simply says the great thing about Meister, I'm paraphrasing, the great thing about Meister Eckhart is that he proves that one can be profoundly evil as a celebration of God. Because if God is actually trying to maximize the possibility of experience, then evil must necessarily be a necessary outcome of the plurality, of the potentiality of experience. And actually, in my chapter in Diseases of the Head, I approach that question from a slightly different way, because part of my chapter is about the book of Job, which, of course, is the great discussion of the nature of God's relationship to evil. It's one of the great early texts on theodicy, like the Bhagavad Gita. And the radicalness of Job, as opposed to the Bhagavad Gita. See, the Bhagavad Gita says, how could a good God will evil, right? How are the two possible? How can they be reconciled? And of course, Krishna's answer is, if we place everything in a cosmic perspective, every single thing that happens is necessary for some other cause, right? So you've got this infinite chain of causality, which creates every conceivable possible situation, of which good and evil simply become possibilities within that chain. Yeah. But what Job does make that argument, but Job goes one step further, which is an extremely radical and subversive concept, which kind of comes close to kind of a divine nihilism, if I can use that word, which is simply this. Job begins his complaint, his discussion, his dialogue with God by saying, undo the day I was born. Take that away, blot that out, so I'm not here to go through this hell that I'm going through. And God says, I can't do that, because what you're asking me to do is to unstitch time. You're asking me to uncreate. And that is the one thing I cannot and will not do, because that is the true anathema. That's a true blasphemy. And if you work on that assumption that experience is inherently good precisely because it is being itself, then questions of good and evil are certainly not unimportant, become of a secondary significance. A good day and a bad day are meaningless terms, because what is good is that there is a day, whatever the content of that day is. That's just happenstance.
I think too, it links too with the, you know, the self perceiving it, right?
Right.
So at one moment, you know, I may perceive it as evil, but perhaps even myself of 10 years ago or whatever would have a very different experience with it. And, you know, 10 years later. So the idea that there is a stable self that is dealing with any of this stuff, I think that's the heart of a lot of the issues of kind of ethic, or of these kind of questions about good and evil. And in Buddhism, that's considered, that is really the source of all suffering, is the self. Or no, not the self, but the belief that self exists, that there's this stable self that continues to basically become the orienting figure in the person's, you know, the being's experience, the consciousness experience. So it's like, you know, saying, okay, I'm only going to see it from this one position, rather than to see that there is a constant connection. There is no separation. You know, we can perceive self and other, but the reality is, even in the act of this, you know, I'm talking to you, here we form this connection. You know, I would not be thinking or saying these things if there was not a lack of separation. If we were really separated, I wouldn't be thinking these things, right? So everything that I experience is showing that there is a connectivity to, it's basically washing away the idea of separation. It's just impossible that separation could occur, you know, at least in a living form. You know, if I cover my mouth, if I put a bag over my mouth, it becomes very clear quite quickly that there is a connection with there's a connection to things. Yeah, there is no isolation.
You're in the basement, I'm in the attic.
It's not a basement. It's a former butcher shop.
Oh, that's even better. Yeah, former butcher shop in the basement.
Yeah.
Concrete walls don't mean a basement.
Well, yeah, okay.
It's something you can hose down.
Well, I've got this beautiful ocean view outside my window, but yeah, if you want to hide out in the basement, now I understand this moving skin thing so much better.
Yeah. It all starts to make sense.
I was going to ask you, is this an autobiographical novel or what?
It's not.
But if you're hanging around in the basement in a butcher shop, I don't know, man. Did you vet all the speakers before you invited them, or do you just recruit people from the street?
No,
I just straight off the website.
Okay, that's right.
You know. I don't have to meet you, so we
that's right. At least I know I'm not going to Osaka now, man. I mean,
come on over.
That's all. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, come to my butcher shop in the basement. We can talk about skins.
Right. No one will hear your cries.
No one will. Yeah, in Osaka, no one can hear you scream.
No. Nah, that's another thing that's impossible.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much. That was nice.
By the way, one last question, because we have to finish in a minute. You're from Jerry. You're from Women's University in Osaka.
I teach at a women's university. So
is this a normal thing in Japan, or is some exclusive school just for women? Why separate the genders?
It used to be quite common. The university I work for, it was, I think, the second women's university in Japan, and it was founded maybe 140 years ago. So it used to be kind of much more common. Now it's becoming less common. I mean, there's fewer children, for one thing. So women's universities, kind of in the past, they were formed originally just kind of to teach the young women how to be married, right? How to take care of houses, how to kind of prepare to take care of children and this kind of stuff. And it's changed, of course, but yeah, it's not a common, but it's not as common as it was in the past. So now most women want to go to a co-ed 4-year university, but yeah, this is a small private university. It's a nice place. Yeah.
Okay, coming from someone who
In the
lives in a
basement.
butcher shop, I'm not so sure. But
Okay, that's fine.
okay.
Yeah, and he teaches young women in schools, and he hangs out in the butcher shop, man.
all the kind of all the points are being made, right? So just connect the dots.
Okay, well, just one last thing before we go, because I was talking about this, Jerry, before we started.
Yeah.
Watch the films The Thing, John Carpenter, circa 1980, greatest Lovecraft movie ever made. I agree. And also the really good Japanese anime on Netflix right now, Doro Hey Doro.
Okay, yeah, I got them both.
Dorohedoro. Doro Hey Doro. Check that out. That's also rather Lovecraftian too.
Can you spell it? So the Doro Hey, what's the second Doro spelled? D-O-R-O?
Dorohedoro.
Okay.
Lost in Chaos.
Yeah, nice.
Beautiful. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you both.
Enjoy the rest of the conference.
For your participation. We hope to see you again at PhilosophyCon sometime. Maybe we'll work on the timing a bit, so you don't have to get up so early, Eric. Sorry about that.
It works well for me. So.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. So see you next time, I hope. Thanks again.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Take care.
By the way, we'll be back after a short break in 7 minutes with the next panel. And the next panel is called The Not So Dunwich Horrors, and we'll hear about witchcraft and measuring the literary horror of the Talmudic accounts involving the supernatural entities.
We are on air now, but give us few seconds.
Yeah, we should
We're
be
preparing
on
everything.
right now. I'll just check the video if there is any sound.
We are on air now, but give us few seconds.
Okay, we're live. Everyone can hear us, see us. No problem so far.
Okay.
So I'm disappearing. You guys go ahead. Thanks.
Great, thank you.
From me, one thing. Thanks for coming, Wojciech, Adam. Welcome to the conference, and I'm leaving you in the competent hands of Dr. Maciej Stanek.
Well, thank you for that. Well, greetings to everybody, both for our speakers and our virtual audience of the last day of the 6th PhilosophyCon. We are starting our next panel entitled The Not So Dunwich Horror. As Mateusz introduced me, I'm Maciej Stanek of the University of Silesia, and I am honored to moderate this part of the conference. We have 3 participants in our schedule. Currently, only 2 of them are available, but I hope that third will come too. So these 3 are Mr. Wojciech Kosior, Mr. Adam Alexandru, and Mr. Zohei Bakheri Naprast. I would like to thank all of you for participation. If I may, I have some remarks that I told you previously in private concerning the order of our meeting. That is as follows. Each speaker will have 20 minutes for his own, and after the speeches, we'll have some time for the discussion. I would advise you, if I may, to not try to extend your time since I'm asked to interrupt you if you would try so. And the last thing is to our audience. So I would like to ask you to make some noise on our chat that we can ask questions for our participants. So maybe I will quiet down and I will introduce our first guest. I would like to invite Dr. Wojciech Kosior of the Jagiellonian University of Krakow, Poland, who will present a paper entitled Measuring the Literary Horror of the Talmudic Accounts Involving the Supernatural Entities. 20 minutes are yours.
Okay, thank you very much. So let me just start my screen sharing. Okay, so, ladies and gentlemen, for the last several years, I've been concerned mainly with my main project, which is the construction of the electronic database of the supernatural entities in the Babylonian Talmud. And when I was invited to participate at this conference, I immediately asked myself, are the accounts which I work with in the Babylonian Talmud, are they in any way horrifying? This question led immediately to several other questions, including the one, how to measure literary horror. And what follows, I would like you to treat it as a kind of a report from a mental exercise, how much can be squeezed from apparently irrelevant data from an apparently a non-horror work by a scholar who is apparently not a specialist in horror studies. Now, the first question was, what is a literary horror? And after doing a quick and dirty review of what I believe are some classical works of horror studies, I found 3 main ideas which resonated with my, let me say, gut feeling of horror. The first such idea is that horror should be perceived as a kind of a mixture of fear and disgust. It's not enough to have something which is just fearful or just disgusting. You need this synergic combination of the 2 elements. The second idea, which I found very relevant, is the idea of probability. In order for horror to work, in order for it to be horrifying, it has to be at least to some extent probable. If it's too improbable, it loses its power. And finally, and of course, as a kind of a homage to HPL, I found the idea of mystery very relevant. In other words, you cannot reveal too much. Horror has to be probable, but it has to strike the right balance between something probable and improbable, unspeakable, mysterious, and so on and so forth. Taking this elements, I concocted the fourfold complex of horror, which consists of fear, disgust, mystery, and reality. But in order to avoid the trap falls associated with a very binary dichotomy of distinction of something which is horror, of something what can be horror or cannot, I decided to use a kind of a continuum. In other words, we can measure the intensity of horror, but as well we can measure the intensity of particular components. In other words, something can be located somewhere between fear and tranquility, disgust and attraction, mystery and explicitness, reality and unreality. In other words, we get a certain kind of a profile of a given horror account. Using this, we can hierarchize and rank stories from least fearful, from least horrifying to most horrifying. Now, the second question is, can we assess the Babylonian Talmud as a literary horror? Now, Babylonian Talmud is obviously a very complex and large corpus of text, but according to the most recent scholarship, we can safely assume, we can safely recognize the authors of this composition. We can locate the authors in time and space. We can recognize certain geographical and historical conditions in which they worked, and we can locate the Babylonian Talmud in the broader literary context. In other words, it transmits certain ideas and pushes them forward. Babylonian Talmud also resorts to a certain number of literary genres which were popular in the era, and we can safely say that it spoke in a language of its times. Finally, the Babylonian Talmud concerns mainly the, we would say, moral and pedagogical issues. In other words, it transmits the idea of how to be a proper adherent of rabbinic Judaism. However, at least in theory, it concerns every aspect of human life, including these less pleasant aspects like dying and disease. In some, we can say that Babylonian Talmud is a literature, or at least can be approached as one, and we can recognize certain emotions evoked by this text, and we can say that the authors played with certain emotions and they utilize it for various purposes. Among these emotions were disgust and fear. Now, the next step is how to deploy these ideas, this fourfold complex, in measuring the horror of the Babylonian Talmud. Let's say we have this account which concerns a specific sage who creates an artificial human, or a golem, as you will, and this golem goes to another sage. The way it is presented in the Babylonian Talmud has a notion of probability. By the way, this fragment is in Aramaic, which is a very, I would say, very strong indicator of the notion of reality. It concerns specific sages, and it gives you this flavor of some kind of mystery, some kind of fear. You have something which is artificial, and we could say that if to find some connections between disgust and uncanniness, this is definitely uncanny. You have a figure which is not necessarily obvious in terms of its ontological status. But the question is, what kind of a yardstick, if you please, we can use to measure the intensity of horror in this fragment? And this is where I would like to connect with my project, which is, as I said, the electronic database of angels, demons, ghosts, and monsters in the Babylonian Talmud, which has a structure of a spreadsheet in which we have specific fragments from the Babylonian Talmud annotated using a very detailed categories. The database plays two main functions. One is of thematic concordance, and we have a very long tradition of concordances in humanities. And we can say that this database allows to quickly find specific passages meeting certain criteria. For instance, we can find all the places in the Babylonian Talmud mentioning a given figure or speaking about a certain subject, or put in this specific genre. The other function of the database is that it allows to perform various kinds of calculations. For instance, we can measure the frequency of certain figures, the appearance of certain figures. We can check for correlations between specific ideas, and so on and so forth. As I said, there is a large number or broad range of categories which pertain both to the contents of these narratives as well as to the formal features. And the main question I asked myself was which of these categories are relevant to horror. Now, the next step was operationalization of this process, and this process involved several steps. First, I took this idea I concocted earlier, the idea of fourfold complex of horror. I unpacked it to have these specific components in here, and as I said, I treated them on a certain kind of continuum. Now, the next step was to recognize categories which I already have in the database, which are relevant to the specific components. In other words, I asked myself what categories, what annotations from my database indicate particular aspects of this fourfold complex. And what I present right now on this slide is a short example of categories I recognize after obviously a very long and brainstorming process. For instance, when we have a compound of fear, I have categories which pertain to specific features of a given supernatural entity. For instance, when entity is gigantic, when it is voracious and hungry, when you have lots of supernatural entities confronted with a human, then we have all the biological and evolutionary rights to expect that it evokes fear even also among the ancients. On the other end of the continuum, we have this idea of safety. For instance, if a given narrative is presented as a part of some abstract scrutinies, if it is presented as a part of some juridical discourse concerning halacha, which is the Jewish law, or if it is presented as a type of medical treatise, all these formal features of portrayal of the supernatural entities translate into the decreased feeling of fear. For instance, this is like if you were reading a medical treatise about something disgusting and fearful, you still have in mind that this is just a medical treatise. The next component was disgust, and if a given account concerned the matters associated with physiology, especially physiology like evacuation, defecation, and urination, if it concerned places which could be considered disgusting, like cemetery full of decaying bodies or toilet, then this translated into the measure of disgust. Finally, two last components, reality and mystery, they were measured using mostly formal features. Reality is a separate and very complex subject I would love to speak about during some other occasion. But in short, it could be said that there are some formal indicators of the text which allow us to infer that a given fragment appeared as real for the authors and redactors of the Babylonian Talmud. So the more real, the more potential to be horrifying. Finally, the last compound is mystery, and due to the lack of a better measure, I decided to resort to the simple character count of English translation. I measured all the accounts. I got the averages, and using it, I was able to find the proper length of a horror story. Now, to show you the nitty-gritty details of this, you should see my spreadsheet file. Here I have specific account. Here I have the fragment which contains the particular categories, and in the next section I have quite complex part consisting of the algorithm counting the intensity of specific components. I would love to explain it in more detail in the questions and answers section, but what is important is that the process is automated. It counts the intensity. Now, obviously, I have all the components, and the question is how to combine all these components into one unified measure, which would give me points of horror. And for this reason, I devised a simplified algorithm, which, for the sake of simplicity, I dissected into three main parts. The first part, which you have in here, this part is intended to get rid and exclude the accounts present in the Talmud, which do not meet this basic criteria of horror. For instance, if we have stories which are very real, but they are not at all fearful or disgusting, they are excluded. Conversely, if we have something which is both fearful and disgusting, but not at all real, then again it is excluded. And I wanted to introduce this part of an algorithm to make sure that only the stories which have some strong potential for horror, they are included in the further scrutiny. The second part of the algorithm is the essential formula, which again I will probably modify it in the future. But for now, it is a simple sum of fear, disgust, and reality minus the safety. And doing this gives me one final number, which in the third step is supplemented by additional points. If the given account strikes the right balance between its brevity and detailedness, if it's not too long, then it gets additional points. If it's too long, then, as I said, it is not horrifying enough. Now, the fourth step of this process was devising a name for the category, and well, I decided to name 1 point of horror as one dagon of horror, and there are three reasons for doing so. First, well, obviously, this is mostly Lovecraftian conference. And second, and at least in my opinion, Dagon is one of the least scary novel of HPL. And if you think about it, it actually makes sense to use something least scary, because otherwise you would need some millidagons, centidagons, and I want to keep things as simple as possible. The third reason is that Dagon has some Semitic background as a deity, and I thought that it might be a good idea to have some Semitic associations. You have Semitic Babylonian Talmud, so it was kind of no-brainer. Now, the part everybody waits, at least myself, these results. After counting after crunching all the numbers, it turned out that, well, as you can see on the attached slide, overall, the Babylonian Talmud is not so much fearful. It's not so much disgusting. These values are very low. On the other hand, some instances, some places from the Babylonian Talmud can appear quite real, and this is one of the important things. Second important observation: from all the almost 800 units, standardized units of text in the Babylonian Talmud, there are only 19 which meet the criteria of horror. Only 19 units which are at the same time fearful, disgusting, probable, and probable, yeah, because these are the three main criteria, and only 19 which are not put in this framework of safety, like halachic discourse or medical discourse. Out of these 19 units, still we get very low averages. This means that even in those passages which are most horrifying against the background of Babylonian Talmud in total, we still have rather peaceful and I would say rather safe entourage. Now, obviously, the question emerges: what is the most horrifying most horrifying account of the Babylonian Talmud, at least as far as these measures are employed? And well, I'll be honest, this is not what I expected, but it's from a certain perspective, it's quite good. The most fearful, the most horrifying story appeared to be this one from Tractate Psachim. It concerns a certain type of demons. this is not that obvious because it has to do with all those nuances of the language of this corpus. However, it speaks about certain type of demons. It locates them in certain places which are, we could say, they are far from safety of human human life. It speaks about woods and shades, which are essentially prone to be fearful, and it concerns the matter of urination. It is not obvious from this specific passage, but we need to read this in the broader context in which it appears in the Babylonian Talmud, and I already indicated it in the annotations. And what is very important, it does not provide any means of counteracting these demons. It doesn't speak about any apotropaic means. It doesn't locate it in the discourse of medicine. And in result, we have an account which is at least potentially quite horrifying. And if you have a look at the profile provided in the lower right of the slide, you can see that it is very real. The text is provided in Aramaic, and we have other formal indicators that it might have appeared as real for the authors. It contains a mixture of fear and disgust, not so intense. However, it was enough to pass the initial test of qualification. It provides no measures of safety, so you don't have to deduce anything from the overall score, and it has the appropriate length to be long enough to be informative, but short enough to leave some mystery. I will be more than happy to show more stories in the questions and answer sections. But for now, conclusions. It is quite obvious that the method I've devised needs some calibration. In fact, it needs a bunch of other things, including the better theoretical grounding. For sure, the subject of disgust is still underrepresented in the formula. So this is something to be done in future. However, with this being said, I still believe that it turned out to be quite interesting to deploy this method in the study of a work which is apparently a non-horror one. In fact, I plan to use some of these elements in my further studies. Especially, I'm very interested in confronting this feature of horror, confronting it with some other aspects of the narratives, like formal issues and but obviously this is a story for some another occasion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your extensive presentation, and this database you prepared seems very, very interesting. I may say personally, I hope we'll have time to discuss it. But for now, let me invite our second speaker, Mr. Adam Alexandru of the, please forgive me my spelling, Uniwersytetu Babeș-Bolyai, Cluj-Napoca, Romania, who will present the paper, Does Witchcraft Destroy Minds? Aesthetics of the Occult as a Means of Expression of Freedom. So please go on.
Okay, thank you. A very good pronunciation, by the way. Okay, so during my presentation, two questions will be answered. First of all, how did the employment of the occult symbolism rise to prominence in the pop culture's attention? Secondly, how congruous is this specific aesthetic with the public's attention's conscience? What characterizes this as a specific socio-cultural relation? Upon this, I will try to outline an aesthetic theory that tries to connect hermeneutically the expressiveness of the occult and the expressed realities, showing that conceptualizing witchcraft has turned up to be a perfectly designed means for speaking for certain social groups. In short, a theory of the occult employed aesthetically cannot overlook its direct implication in social change. Therefore, two aspects need to be grounded theoretically. The first one, the occult in pop culture, and the second one, its role as an agent in social change, an active agent. For the first one, I am addressing Adorno. In his thesis against occultism, he states clearly that the presence of the occult in the public eye is a regression in conscience. He emphasizes the dangers of this by saying that it is a symptom of a certain fall in obscure and ideologically fertile spiritualities. In short, witchcraft destroys minds. Now, I know that his analysis is a social-political one, but I think it can be extended to the field of art. Therefore, I am disagreeing with Adorno, and I'll try to prove that the semiotics of the occult turned up to be a lucid, refined, rational way for aggressively addressing problems of marginality. And this gives me my second theoretical aspect, the relationship between art and social change. Now, a lot has been written on this topic. I'm only going to mention Schusterman, who observes the bidirectionality of the relationship between art and social change. Now, others notice how esoterical groups are potential active agents because they have this power of potentially birthing new, fresh, central socio-political powers. Following up all these, what my thesis turns out to be is this: hermeneutics of art that has at least undertones of occult symbolism must begin from observing that most of it advocates for marginal groups of individuals. There are articles that determine the esotericism of certain socio-political groups is a factor that helps to build and reinforce individuality. And I add, aesthetically, art that speaks for people far from the center aggressively shouts towards that center. It tries to capture the attention of a by aggressiveness because it is the only way that the cozy, ignorant center, if I may put it this way, can be shaken. Basically, what I'll try to prove is that witchcraft can free and liberate minds. I will further try to demonstrate, therefore, how the occult came to be such an aesthetic means of speaking for social change by presenting 3 stages of expressiveness by which the occult has already been employed in art, and particularly in music. I'm going to talk about music. These stages are what I'm calling them aesthetic psychological expressiveness, aesthetic narrative expressiveness, and aesthetic social expressiveness. Now, I'm looking at the second half of the 20th century because it is my belief that the greatest merit in popularizing the occult symbolism goes to the rock genre, understood here in its most broad sense. So it's only natural to look upon it in order to have a better understanding of this phenomena. But I prefer to cautiously take a step back and analyze something that has happened prior to this. And I'm thinking of Maria Callas's rendition of Cherubini's Medea. I'm not doing this just for the sake of the argument. I'm doing this because I'm interested in the way witches are portrayed in opera, in the opera world. And by this, I'm trying to find how the occult is employed as a specific aesthetic type of expressivity. There are other operas that have witches as characters. For example, Il Trovatore Azucena or The Magic Flute's Queen of the Night. And there are other operas that present us with horrorish or thrilling areas. For example, Nabucco's Abigail or Macbeth's Lady Macbeth. But I find Medea quite unusual. This opera, in my opinion at least, does not fit the usual stereotype. And why do I think this? Well, because here we are confronted with a woman who has all the power. It is by Medea's choice that everything happens the way it happens. It is by her choice that everything ends the way it ends. And this power is expressed through full force aesthetic manifestations of song. It is, in my opinion, one of the most violent and striking operas ever written, and Maria Callas's rendition brings it to its full potential. Now, of course, the occult singing, if I may say so, definitely corresponds to a certain mental degradation of the heroine through the narrative, from a mother and capable of love person to a stripped of humanity and embodiment of hell-furious being. But I think there is a nuance of understanding here. Medea is a woman that is portrayed as the one having all the power. And in doing this, the horror occult aesthetics comes almost as an excuse, as a method of permeating into the world of opera. The public is shocked, the public is trembling, the public is defenseless in front of a woman, and if I may say so, the public is thus confronted with a more feminist story, at least in the world of opera. But of course, I'm not trying to make any apology to Cherubini. I'm only hinting at this. So this is the example of the occult employed as an aesthetic psychological expressiveness. And what I say by this is that it is used for portraying mental change during the narrative. It isn't a thing of its own. Now, if we want to observe the occult semiotics employed as a thing of its own, we must finally gaze at what, in my opinion, is the most crucial moment in the history of the rock metal genres with regards to satanic symbolism. And this is Coven's first album that appeared in 1969, and which is entitled Witchcraft Destroys Minds and Reaps Souls, which also gives the title of my presentation. Now, this album has long enough been standing, I think, in the shadow of other more popular timelines that circulate between members of the metal community or critics. It is a concept album that tells the story of a group of women that are involved in witchcraft. The songs describe certain witches or certain events that have as main plot witches that take revenge upon certain men, especially witch hunters. Now, Jinx Dawson is the main vocalist, and she leads everything up to the point of almost actually performing being a witch. She acts like a witch, she sings like a witch. This enactment and this particular engagement in the concept story of the album makes it a masterpiece and marks what I am naming here the aesthetic narrative expressiveness. The occult is no longer used to emulate psychological change, or it is not only used for that. It is used as a thing of its own. Jinx Dawson sings about witches. She sings as a witch. There is no metaphor. There's no need for a rational explanation. The influence this had over the subsequent genres of extreme rock and metal is immeasurable. But one thing is for sure. Is for sure that after this, it became more and more natural to bring forth within music stories of the occult or employment of this type of symbolism. An observation is needed here too, as in Medea's case. The 60s, especially the prog rock scene, were highly misogynistic, and listening to Coven's first album can strike a sensitive chord. And I asked myself, why did a female-fronted band make use of Satan to break through? Why did they need the controversy? Now, for this stage of my presentation, I will leave the question as it is. Just the possible connection between controversy and breaking through as a woman-fronted band being enough. Now, performing satanic or occult music in the 20th century did not leave things at the narrative expressiveness level. Diamanda Galas is the one that fully conceptualized the semiotics of the occult, making use of it plainly as an aesthetic structure ready to be filled with a certain message. In her music, the occult does not speak of the occult, it speaks of certain social problems. Therefore, I'm calling this stage the aesthetic social expressiveness. Here, the occult becomes a means of expressing something, but what? Well, she has stated throughout her entire career almost that she sings mainly for people from the queer community that struggle with AIDS or people that struggle with mental disorders. But why sing for stigmatized groups in such a specific manner? From this question, my understanding of the aesthetics of the occult arises. The art of Galas tries to shake, to undermine the center of a society that is discriminating. People are drawn to the bizarre, but Diamanda Galas draws them only to shock them. And in shocking them, she is leaving them defenseless. It is almost like a trap. People are shocked and therefore they are defenseless in facing her message. And this menagerie of the occult is a masterful use of aesthetic responses and thus a lucid and highly studied aesthetic product that can be a lot of things but a regression in conscience. Now, the occult as an aesthetic expressiveness gives birth to a certain type of aesthetic response. And I find that response to be shock. In being shocking, the occult manages to produce controversy, fear, disgust, or even rejection. But as I've outlined from the three examples, music that employs the occult isn't a music easily to digest. It doesn't face pop culture as congruous. It faces it as a critique. But the critique it manages to make isn't something that a popular culture is by definition ready to accept by simple, more common and soft means. The critique brought by the occult music is a critique for an ignorant society and how to catch the ear of the one that is ignorant than by yelling at them, shocking them. The shock response is employed as a lucid aesthetic mechanism for capturing attention in a complete way. The shock leaves no room for interpretation. The audience is left, as I've said before, defenseless. They cannot partake in digressions of interpretation because the aesthetic prowess of the occult makes it impossible. You are left blank by shock, ready to be filled with message. And the message is one of freedom. Freedom of certain social groups that pop culture in its historical evolution in some ways neglected or treated badly. For example, the queer community or women. Now, I'm trying to bring my presentation to an end. And therefore, I will simply outline the main ideas that I managed, hopefully, to bring to your attention. It has been the concern of this presentation to demonstrate how, in the second half of the 20th century, the occult employed aesthetically has suffered a gradualized conceptualizing and became a particularly important agent in speaking for social change. It is my belief that if we want to address this type of aesthetic semiotics, we must do so in trying to understand the shock response that it brings and the way it is employed as a mechanism of epistemological pretext, after all. My last remark is witchcraft, employed aesthetically at least, definitely does not destroy minds. On the contrary, it is a fascinating method of building knowledge, of opening minds, and of learning about the freedom of others. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam, very, very much. Well, after both your speeches, we have quite several questions for you guys, and I think that we may start from them. So maybe let's give Adam a little break. And two first questions to Wojciech. I will send them to you via our chat. Maybe it would be simpler if you read them and answer.
Okay.
You should see them right now.
Okay. Why people like scary movies? Why do you like to be afraid? Well, first of all, I do not feel competent to answer these questions, but of course I'm going to do so anyway. But the one interpretation I found in the context of especially evolutionary psychology, which I very much resonate with, is that the best thing about being scared, is that you feel a relief afterwards. If you live long enough to experience it. So, in other words, this would be that the scary element is pleasant due to what comes afterwards, and this is one interpretation. Another interpretation, which I very much resonate with, is that being afraid, feeling fear in various intensity, is that it gives you you are stimulated. This is especially apparent, and I keep reading about it all the time, or it pops out every time I read about fear. That in so-called contemporary times, especially in the Western society, we are deprived of fearful and really dangerous situations, and therefore we have this need for something which would fill this gap. In other words, we are not endangered by large animals. Usually, what we eat does not translate into immediate death. Of course, we can eat ourselves to death, but this is a very long process, and we want to act out this fear in the context of fantasy, imagination. The third idea, which I would like to connect here, is that again an idea which I found in the context of evolutionary psychology, in explanations of why do we like stories, and why do we like to read stories or experience them via other mediums. And the answer is that it gives us opportunity to test ourselves in a very safe, in a kind of sandbox. In other words, we can experience all those strong emotions, but still we have this safe switch. We can turn off TV, we can put the book away, and in a way, it is like a play. If you look at the play at evolutionary one of the probable evolutionary functions of playing, it is the testing, a kind of a boot camp. You learn something by imitating the adults, or when you are an adult, you imitate the professionals. For instance, you can have a paintball fight, you can have a boxing match in gloves, and so on and so forth, and you can imitate it, and in a similar manner, maybe you can imitate the feeling of fear and dealing with it. This is something you have to learn to act when being scared. But as I said, these are just my intuitions. Please take them with a grain of salt. Now, the other question, where is the ET component? I'm not quite sure if I understood it correctly. May I ask for some additional a sentence or two of explanation?
Well, we may ask about it, but I'm not sure whether this person is still on our chat. If he or she will do this explanation, I will return to you. But I believe that looking on the time when it was posted, that it was connected to your presentation, to the schemes you presented. But I'm not exactly sure in what certain moment it was posted.
Okay, fear, disgust, probability, mystery. Okay, the only association I have with ET is that alien, but I think it's not relevant here.
Probably not that. So okay, so give him or her some time.
Yes,
and now 2 questions to Adam, if I may. You can find it on our chat. Thank you, Wojciech, very much.
Okay.
Have you received this?
Yeah.
Great.
So the question regarding horror films, I don't think it's for me.
Well, but it was after during your presentation. That's
okay. Then I'll try to answer. What is the point of horror films focused on violence against people and animals? Well, I'm certainly not really well read in this, but what I can answer is there's a plethora of explanation, especially there are many of the explanations that even philosophers try to give are in some way, on one hand, quite interesting, and it seems like they're doing their job, and on the other hand, they're quite unusual. I'm thinking here at Kristeva's explanation for violence against women in horror movies. Well, I don't know. I have this tendency to falling into the psychoanalytical part of the explanations. They're more close to my heart. So I think that there is a possible explanation from this area of expertise, but I'm really not that well read in this. Now, the answers can be quite unusual. I mean, Julia Kristeva gives a very interesting account of slasher movies, if I'm not mistaken, and she says that we go to the cinema to watch this feminine figure being basically slaughtered, and in doing so, we let our subconscious kill our own mother, and it is a psychoanalytical explanation that's quite extraordinary, if I may say so, but quite interesting. I mean, there are many answers, and I do not wish to just quite be, I don't know. I don't want to answer this just for the sake of talking. I don't think I can answer this.
Okay, thank you.
Second question. So the devil is 8 here? No. Certainly not. This is what I tried to outline. It's a very good question, though, because in her performances, it seems like firstly, we encounter this woman that screams and shrieks and shouts devilish incantations and recites from the Leviticus, and I don't know. things about the devil and all of these. But as I have said, she uses this in my analysis. This is what I have come up to, that she uses this merely as an aesthetic structure. I think that she wants to speak in a genuine way for people that suffer, and speaking genuinely for people, for certain people that suffer, cannot be a soft, more, I don't know, mainstream way of doing this. There's an interview of her from 1992, I guess. If you type on YouTube the Amanda Galassi interview, I think it's the first one, and there she states quite clearly. I mean, she is quite radical in her approach, but no, the AIDS is not the devil here. AIDS is just a disease that certain people happen to have, and we must fight socially and through art in order that those people aren't discriminated against anymore. No, AIDS is just a disease in her vision.
Okay, thank you so much. So now maybe it will be a turn for Wojciech, and we have some specifics of this previous question. I'm pasting it to you. Just give me a second. One moment. It's a part of the longer longer post. Okay, here you go. This first sentence I've sent you on chat is this specification of the previous question.
Okay, it is our steering our reality, gnostics. This reality is artificial, created by beings with higher technology. We are not the first civilization here, proof forbidden archaeology. Okay, so I cannot answer this question. This is something which I did not include in the measure of horror, and therefore, well, as an academician, as I like to think about myself, I have the privilege of deciding which aspects of horror, which aspects of reality I measure, and the shortest answer is the way I measure horror does not include it is. So therefore, as I said, I cannot answer these questions. Let me now move to the next one. Maybe the sound of words and names also create horror. Do you think this category sound be also included in your that is mine horror formula? This is a good one. And it connects nicely with the problem of the names of the supernatural entities. And here we have several problems. The first one is the translation. Some of the words, like demons, angels, monsters, and so on and so forth, are obviously English translations, which do not give full justice to what we have in the database. Second, the very category of supernatural entity is obviously an ethic external category, and therefore it blurs out some of the nuances. It is of course a certain kind of interpretation I give to these figures. The third problem, I would actually invert this question in order to say that some of the words which are used to denote or connote, it depends on what you prefer, to denote, connote some particular figures, they had initially been very, I would say, very mundane. For instance, if you have one of the words which is often used by the Babylonian Talmud for a demonic being, this word is mazik. It literally means something. It is active participle, meaning something is destroying or something is creating damage, a damaging one. And this word is applied in other contexts. So I would say that to answer the question directly, I would say that no, I don't believe the words initially could be included in the formula because we encounter too many problems, like the possibility of a word. As I said, mazik is one example. Ruach, which is wind, is another example. We have this problem that they might have functioned as regular words. Maybe if we measured the power of the word in, let's say, contemporary Western Occidental tradition, for instance, Lilith, Satan, Behemoth, Leviathan, and so on and so forth, maybe even the sound of the words nowadays could have some horrifying quality, but mainly due to the cultural background behind these figures. With this being said, I like very much the idea that some words possess some onomatopoeic. Please excuse my pronunciation. They possess some formal features which make them less or more scary. For instance, when you have lots of rks, prr, and other explosive sounds, which you might probably hear through my microphone, then they have some quality of something exploding, something which is scary. And actually, after thinking some more during answering this question, I think that this might be. After all, this might be something interesting. Maybe there are some specific vowels, some specific sounds in particular names, which could translate into some semantic features of a given entity. So thank you very much for this question. Just let me write it down because I think it has some potential. Just have to switch for Polish. Okay, now this fourth question. Take some examples, historical figures. You could do a movie on that, good one, or a computer game. What about Gnostical archons? As I said, I don't feel competent to answer this question. Thank you.
Okay, great, thank you. So Adam, it's your turn for next two questions. You will find them right now.
Yeah. Can you explain the difference between occultism and Satanism? Well, what I can say is that in my presentation, I've used them interchangeably, that's for sure. I didn't make a research on this specifically, but there is a difference. And I know there is a difference. And if we are to... I was talking about the history of the extreme metal genres. Well, if we say Satanism in black metal, for example, well, there are certain artists that have stated that they are Satanists. And in that sense, well, yes, Satanism differentiates itself from other types of belief, I guess. I mean, from what I know, Satanism is or may be a type of philosophy of life and certain things like that. But as I've said in my presentation, I've used them interchangeably. What factors influence the fascination with Satanism? Well, that's a very interesting question. Well, I guess people really are drawn to the bizarre. I mean, the question may be answered from 2 points of view. Influence the fascination, but the fascination of who? Of whom? fascination of pop culture in general, or fascination of certain individuals, because in general, art that employs symbols of occultism isn't art for everyone, or at least it doesn't name itself as being popularizing. It doesn't want to be popular. But I guess it doesn't fascinate so much, I mean, masses of people. But I think it's fascinating mainly because it's provoking. It's provoking. It produces a type of controversy, and because of its unknown character. I mean, I don't know this. Oh, what's this? Oh, it's also scary. Then yeah, perfect. I'm going to listen to this because it's bizarre, and it makes me feel special sometimes. That's an answer.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, I hope that our audience won't blame me for that, but you know, your speeches were so interesting. I also wanted to ask even one question from me. So first to Wojciech, if I may, since personally I feel horrified a bit about measuring everything, especially this, especially measuring affects or emotions. And I have more qualitative questions. What is fearful about this golem? You have put a quotation in your presentation. Is it this golem itself, or maybe his creators are some supernatural entities that have some supernatural powers? Since I believe that from the standard classical philosophical view, this golem is nothing miraculous, maybe even natural in this way. And one more, how many units would you assign for this story? Since in the second one you put some numbers in the corner, but at this there wasn't any. Thank you.
Okay, so let me share my screen, because it will be much easier for me to provide an answer. So the first matter. This is not so. I would say this was more of a spontaneous choice. When I was the moment I was invited to this conference, and when I decided that this might be a good subject to speak, I tried to find, without checking the database, I tried to recall from my memory an account which I personally find most fearful, the one I remember, the one which got very, very deep in my memory, and the one which, at least by myself, could be seen as a good start for a contemporary horror movie. And this is why I came with this specific instance. And if I were to describe it from a more, let's say, qualitative rather than quantitative perspective, I would say so. I would say that first, it is very short. In fact, here you have English translation. The Aramaic original is about half of a volume of this. A lot of what you get here is absent from the Aramaic text. For instance, the original does not speak about golem. What you have here, it is just the specific edition of the Babylonian Talmud, which translates and puts a paraphrase, puts a commentary right beside the translation. Maybe this is not the best translation to work with, definitely, but this is in my opinion, this is a very good translation to show to other people who are not familiar with very, very specific and very difficult language of the Talmud. So, in other words, the fragment is very, very short. So it is a mystery. The second thing, which I personally found in this to be quite scary, is that here you have a popular sages. They appear in lots of other places. They are quite often mentioned. And what is important, they are relatively late sages. By this, I mean that they come from the more modern part of the Babylonian Talmud. And seen from this perspective, they appear as more contemporary to the authors and redactors of the Babylonian Talmud. This is as if to say, please excuse me this metaphor, but let's say Napoleon Bonaparte is, at least to me, appears as more real than Ramses II, because he's more recent, or at least this is what I was taught in school. So you have this notion of reality. The story is presented in a way as a regular account, something which happened to the specific rabbi. And when you have this very short fragment speaking about the creation, these are just 3 Aramaic words which sounds something like this: Rava, Bara, Gavra. Well, you don't need to know Aramaic to hear that this has some potential to become a kind of a spell or invocation, because you have this homophony of words. It is something. And given the fact that the rabbis were particularly careful about words and the way how they sound and how they mix together, this is something which at least it gives me creeps. At least when I read it in original. Finally, you have no explanation. You have no description of this figure. He is described with a regular word for a man. So there is nothing special. But at the same time, he's liminal. He appears as if it is at the same time a regular man and not a regular man. And this immediately gave me this feeling of uncanniness. I don't know if it is a figure created or it is just a story, and the way it is presented, well, in short, I can't get rid this out of my mind. And probably there are some psychoanalytical reasons why I cannot do so, but I don't want to get into this. However, with all those emotions I get from reading this passage, well, I can tell you how much points it got according to my magical formula. Just give me a moment. I need to find this passage. And here we have Golem. First of all, it did not make it through the first test, so it is not considered to be good material for horror, because it doesn't have this combination of disgust. It is not at all disgusting according to the measures I deployed, and it got 10 horror points, but this does not qualify. Probably if it had some measure of disgust, then it would compete with these stories, which according to my formula were the most horrifying. Did I answer your question?
Yes, I believe yes, with one exception.
Yeah.
So supposing that this golem, this special kind of man, or even because it is not natural man, as I understood your few last sentences. Well, so where is this monstrosity, this something strange, miraculous, or whatever we can call it? So is this supernatural thing at the part of this creator or its creator?
I would say that first of all, one thing I forgot to mention, but what I find to be essential is that we don't have any other account speaking about creation of artificial man by a man in early rabbinic literature, as far as I know. This idea of golem, understood as artificial creation of human who made it out of clay and wrote emet, truth, on its forehead and make it live, and then you have this golem of Prague story, which is so intensely popular. This is something of later stages. At that stage, and by that stage I mean the first several centuries of Common Era. This is something very unique, and every time we have stories like this, for which we don't have immediate parallels, at least in the rabbinic literature, then at least this is how I approach it. I don't really know what to do with it. We have other supernatural entities described in the creation process. We have accounts which tell that, for instance, a given creature was created by the deity. A given creature was appeared as a result of a certain kind of evolution out of a certain animal. With this, we have nothing to compare to. The only parallel I can think of are the accounts which speak about the deity which creates human. And the way this fragment is presented in the Talmud suggests that we should read it as a kind of not literally, but just a kind of, well, let's say homily, a parallel, a simile, something. You have this hyperbolic idea of humans so righteous that they can imitate the deity. But as I said, this is something not typical for the Babylonian Talmud. And to answer your question directly, what is the supernatural? If I understood well, what is the supernaturality of this account? It is the only place in which human. And even to be more specific, in which a human uses this very specific Hebrew verb bara, which is used to denote cases when something is created or divided. You have this. The word is deployed in Genesis 1 when when Elohim is spoken about and said that Elohim creates or divides bara, heavens and earth. And when you look at the other accounts in the Babylonian Talmud which speak about the creation of supernatural entities, exactly this word, this Hebrew verb is deployed. It is even more striking because in this fragment you have almost everything in Aramaic, and then out of the blue you have a Hebrew verb, which I guess was purposely put in this specific place, as if to say human imitates deity. And if to understand supernatural as something which is unusual, of course we have lots of problems with this idea. I would say that supernaturality lies in the fact of creation, not exactly in the creation of what is being created. The way this man is, because it is a man, it's definitely a masculine figure. The way this figure is portrayed does not give us enough reasons to believe it is something very unusual about it. So I would say that if to treat this whole thing as continuum, I would say that more supernaturality lies on the side of the creator rather than on the creation itself. Does it answer your question? Because it's very difficult to avoid digressions.
It's great answer for my question, but it raises some more. So, for example, maybe the creator is the one that we should fear more than this creature.
Quite probably so.
Okay, but thank you. Let us return to Adam. Thank you a lot. So, Adam, my personal question to you: can you explain one more general issue than just undertaken? Since I have one problem, specifically whether it is possible to the true occult to be connected to pop culture, since the name occult itself, it means that something is hidden and should remain hidden, and should be only available for the chosen ones. So how can you connect these two ideas?
Yeah, a great question, and I'll answer this. Perhaps my presentation was quite radical, and the examples that I gave, in naming them, this is this and this is that, well, this was very theoretical, but I think that except for the case of Medea, even in the case of Cavern's first album and Diamanda Galas's discography, almost the entire discography, it has a quality of this hidden thing. They are hidden artistic products. They cannot be known fully. This reminds me that I've been reading yesterday, I think, that on the back of their first CD, the band Coven wrote, "This is very powerful witchcraft. This should not be listened by anyone that does not understand it. This is real things. This is a real thing." And the album culminates in a satanic mass that goes on for almost 17 minutes, and it's just the mass. There is no music. All these examples of art present themselves as being a cult. Yes, there's no question in that, and there are many bands. I think here of for example, from the heavy metal scene, from Merciful Fate to I don't know, Venom, even though they're proto black metal, and I don't know. There are many examples of bands that see themselves as being a cult, but that doesn't mean that we cannot partake in an interpretation of the function of that art. This is what I tried to do. I tried to demonstrate that even though it presents itself as being hidden, as being inaccessible, I tried to show that most of the times, or at least in these three very important examples, it has another role. It isn't just for the sake of being hidden. It's something else. Yeah. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, of course you answered, but I'm a historian, and I'm looking in some historic way on this problem. And as first medieval or early Renaissance alchemists were looking for something that is occult, so they were looking for something like philosophical stone, true medicine, etc. So the foundation of the reality, and something that could give them a way they can rule the world, in fact. And my next question is whether in this art there is only some hidden sense, or something really more fundamental from the ontological point of view, or something like that, metaphysical.
Well, I certainly believe that there are artists that see their work as being quite. With reference to the ontological point of view, I'm sure that they see their art as being, relevant or really true in some way. Well, I'm sure that there are bands that do that. I don't have an example that comes to mind, unfortunately, but I'm sure that that there are examples. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Guys, we couldn't answer more completely, but yeah.
Okay, it fits to me. Thank you. We have some time and several questions for both of you, but there is one much lighter than my last ones. It is for both of you. So, question for all: what is your favorite horror movie and why? Wojciech is first, if you may.
This is something which got me completely off guard. Actually, there are. If I squeeze myself and if put against the wall, I can think of two movies. One is, if I'm not mistaken, it's Creeping Death. Or something with creeping in the title, and a few words of commentary. I saw it as a child. I was about 9 or probably 10 years old, and I remember that it destroyed my childhood for quite a long period of time, and I had to watch this movie again as an adult to get past through my infantile nightmares. And this is one movie, and I cannot say what is so special about it because I don't want to spoil it. I recommend it. That's one thing I can say. Assuming that probably when Adam is going to answer his part, I'll Google the title and provide it. So this is the first movie, and the second movie. Again, Creeping Flesh. Thank you very much. This is that's the one. And the second movie, as far as I know, it's not classified as horror. It's more of a thriller. And the English title, I believe it was a Dutch movie. I'm not quite sure. However, the English title was Disappearance. And something like this. Again, I cannot say too much about the movie because I would spoil it. But let me say this: the ending movie destroyed my childhood even more than the first movie. And as was the case with the first one, I had to watch it twice as an adult to get through it, but still the very idea of what happens in the end gives me chills. And by saying this, I cannot recommend it more. These are actually the two films which came to my mind immediately. So I think these are the scariest ones, apart from the ones I have in my subconsciousness because they were too frightening for me to recover. Thank you for this question.
Okay, thank you too, Adam.
Well, I'll answer quite shortly. I don't know if this answer is one that is an answer that is going to be pleasing, but I guess my favorite horror movie is Rocky Horror Picture Show, and that's it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So I believe after this light question, we can come back to more firm, stable. So Wojciech, question 5 and 6 is right now at your chat.
Okay, and I provided the title. It's Vanishing from 1988. I highly recommend it. Okay. Question number 5. Can you repeat where one can get acquainted with this bestiary you have created? Of course, you just have to type. Let me share my screen. You just have to type the phrase which should appear in a moment. Just type Elionim Vetachtonim. This is going to be one of the first results. It will lead you to the website of the project. The website of the project contains all the basic information. It contains in the legacy tab, it contains everything I wrote about it, a manual, a theory behind it. It contains other presentations in a moment, including this one, and you are more than welcome to see it. And the second question,
pardon, can you allow me to put the link to this? I found it, of course, while you're giving instructions. Can I put this at our chat for our audience? Thank you.
Certainly, thank you. Okay, and the sixth question is, how in Kosior methodology, this me, study elements of horror beyond human language? Like, for example, in Lovecraft mythology, where the great old ones are often indescribable, and therein lies the terror. Now, as I said before, the way I deploy this tool, or the way I conceptualize this method, involves language. It does not involve iconography, the formal qualities of sounds, and other features. It is a very verbal method. And if I were to analyze the works of HPL, I would do something like this. I would try to translate of HPL into the categories I use in the database. Of course, this is a very dirty work of a very quick and dirty way of doing it, and I would focus on what is written. If, for instance, Lovecraft was very fond of using several adjectives, including amorphic or amorphous, unspeakable, and so on and so forth. And he was very insistent in saying that we don't have appropriate words. In fact, we don't have the vocal capabilities of pronouncing some of the names. I would say this indications as something frightening, as something which may evoke horror. If you have written in a text in a human manner that something is unspeakable, itself, it can be taken as an indicator. Of course, it is in a way avoiding the problem of what is beyond language. But the short answer is the method I devised works only with language or with something which can be translated into human language. So in short, if it was to be put in, let's say, in analyzing the thought processes of Sleeping Cthulhu, it would probably fail. Thank you.
Thank you. And we have 5 minutes. It should be enough for 2 questions to Adam.
Yeah. Okay. Why do you think shock leaves one ready to hear any message? Yeah, well, this is basically my theory for this presentation. Well, what I'm thinking when I say shock is a type of aesthetic response that makes the one that listens, because we're talking about music, makes the one that listen. I don't know how to put this better than I already did. Well, in shocking people, interpretation is impossible. The shock factor acts like, as I've said in my final words of the presentation, the shock acts like an epistemological pretext, mainly because it paves the way for a certain message. What I want to say is that I am not free to interpret anything. I am firstly shocked. I am firstly devoided of any powers of interpretation, and afterwards the message comes stripped of any other embellishments. Let me put it that way. I hope I answered your question. And the next one is shock as an artistic treatment in today's pop culture and art. After or in postmodernism, not shocking anymore? Well, I love this question. What my answer would be is that, well, certainly sensibilities change, and the sensibilities of the pop culture in particular change very fast. But that doesn't mean that the shock factor does not continue to function in the way that I've tried to outline. It just means that it himself, the shock, must change according to that sensibility. Therefore, if popular music changes, the shocking factor needs to change also. And well, my personal opinion is that nowadays shock is something much more elusive. I mean, I think we are much more used to shock, but I think that at the same time, many surprises are to come, and that's my opinion.
But if I may ask something supplementing this, since how about this postmodernism after or in postmodernism? Because probably the author didn't know whether we are living still in this.
Yeah, well, I believe that the shock factor is employed. I'll just say nowadays. I believe that the shock factor is employed nowadays with regards to especially aesthetic structure. In my opinion, I mean, art art turned up to be so conceptual and so powerful in its structural meaning that it is no longer necessarily something very important to do. I mean, I'm referring here at statements. Statements can be done much more with much more elusiveness. They can be done in a plethora of ways. With regards to structure, yes.
Great, thank you. So, guys, 2:10, and I believe we surely can speak for hours on both of your papers, but unfortunately, the time is as is, so our time has passed. Thank you very, very much for this discussion and for your papers. So we have now a little break in our program, and we are coming back. Let me see. We are coming back at 3:20, but now there will be FTB studio on this channel. So thank you very much once more, our guest. Thank you for the audience, and see you later.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone, both the guests and the viewers. Sorry, I switched that off. We're taking a short break, rather a long break, an hour or so. We have to get our strength back up, and after the break, we will meet you at. Let me check if I remember correctly. We'll meet you at 3:30 for the panel Pigment's Other Models. And the man that just moderated this discussion, Maciej Stanek, will return as a guest, along with his friend Monika Mansfeld, and I will be the moderator. They will talk about the medieval times and monsters, I guess. Yeah, about basilisks and other vicious beasts. Then we'll have the panel titled ACLO. It will be a bit about language, metaphors, the mind. We'll have guests from UK, USA, and after that, the very last panel of this conference, the Dreamlands. You will hear about Lovecraft and Werner Herzog. You will also hear about the cult Lovecraftian game, Dark Corners of the Earth. And also, if you've watched the Netflix series Stranger Things, there will be a bit about that. After the panel, we'll spend some time in the FTB studio on the Polish channel. We've decided during this conference to make it exclusively in Polish, so sorry for the misleading information in the program. We'll have to work on that and do it better in the future. And after the studio, there will be two concerts. We will meet with Anastasia Szalik, who will play the keyboard a bit and tell us about her art, her music rather. And after her show, our guest from Friday will return We will again be host to Bloody Crook, who will hopefully manage to finish his concert this time. So, thank you for your attention, and we'll see you in a bit over an hour. Goodbye.